Chapter 11, Evidence for Evolution. Have you ever wondered why, when you go to the doctor and they give you antibiotics, they always warn you to take all of your antibiotics? It's because if you don't do that, the bacteria will become resistant, and the next time you get the antibiotic, it will not work. That is evolution in action. Evolution is a change in the inherited characteristics of a group of organisms over generations. We simply refer to it as change over time. Populations evolve, individuals do not. It's a very important topic. There are a number of important topics that are sort of overreaching themes as we know them within the biology. One of them is the importance of the cell. We've talked greatly about the cell. You can't be alive if you're not cellular. That's why a virus isn't alive. There are other important themes like structure married to function. What does it do? And what is the part itself? But another important theme in biology is evolution, change over time in living organisms. It has often been said, famously, that nothing in biology makes sense outside of the light of evolution. That's a very famous quote from a famous scientist. The idea is that things make more sense in biology looked at through the lens of evolution. So really, you should think about every topic that we talk about from an evolutionary perspective. To understand evolution, you have to understand the difference between natural selection and artificial selection. So, artificial selection, also known as breeding, is where we get the different, for example, breeds or subspecies of dogs. All dogs are a single species, Canis lupus familiaris, which is a subspecies of the gray wolf. Domestication of gray wolves began 16,000 years ago. So, what would happen is that wolves would be bred so that they would be more domesticated. They would have a more kind personality. They would be more loyal. They would be more of the kind of animal that you'd be interested in. And then as they were domesticated, you breed for hair length, maybe snout characteristics, personality. And over time, you generate evolution, but it is done artificially. It's also called selective breeding. You could do it with cows. You keep breeding big cows and you continue to get bigger and bigger cows. So the gray wolf is at the very top of of the the phenogram. And then as you work your way down the family tree, you have the European, North American, the different continents and their subspecies till we finally arrive at what we have today. So that means you can trace each species back to its common ancestor. So some good vocabulary to know when you're studying evolution is common ancestor. Okay. And so a common ancestor is an ancestor that two different species or subspecies have in common. So these two species here, feral and chow, have as their common ancestor the gray wolf, but as you work your way down, these two species, the Asian and dingo, have as their common ancestor a feral dog, but they do not share that common ancestor with, for example, gun dogs. All right, they have a different ancestor, scent hounds, which they share with spaniels. That's some of the ways that we use these diagrams. All right, so natural selection, however, is a process by which individuals with advantageous inherited characteristics for a particular environment survive and reproduce at a higher rate than do individuals with less useful characteristics. We call this survival of the fittest. It doesn't always mean bigger, stronger, faster. It can, but what ends up happening is what gets your genes in the next generation, those traits, which might be bigger, faster, stronger, but they might just also be attractiveness and mating. Those are called advantages or adaptations. You'll hear us use those words. The characteristics of individuals that breed most successfully become more common in successive generations. Whoever has the most kids wins. The overall changes are seen over time across the entire population, not individuals. That's very key. We're not talking about the individual evolving. We're talking about the whole species or the whole population evolving. A population can evolve via natural selection so that more and more individuals have beneficial traits and fewer have disadvantaged traits. An adaptation is an evolutionary process or a feature by which populations become better matched to its environment. So, for example, the finch beak is properly evolved, perfectly evolved for the size and type of seed that it eats. The beak would be called an adaptation. That's a very famous example. Bigger beaks go with bigger seeds, smaller beaks go with smaller seeds. from a common ancestor with an average size beak, which could only eat an average size fruit or seed. But as you had bigger and smaller fruits, bigger and smaller beaks, you would see those stick around in the population. All right, so what's the evidence for evolution? We're going to do several chapters on evolution and mention it quite a bit in coming chapters, but what is the evidence for it? How do we know it's true? 6 lines of evidence. We can observe it in the fossil record, for example. That's one of the more famous ones. We can also see it in DNA. An organism that you're closely related to, you'll have more similarities in your DNA, etc. All right, first line of evidence is fossils. A fossil is a preserved specimen. It can either be preserved intact, like this insect is fully preserved in amber. You could also preserve in like tar. There's a famous tar pit in LA called La Brea Tar Pits. They even made a TV show about it recently, La Brea, and those fossils are fully preserved. Most fossils are either parts, like just a foot or a tailbone or a skull, or they're an imprint. And so from them, you can study and see what maybe the ancestors were. Very important because a lot of these species that are fossilized aren't alive today, so you don't have them to compare to. So, for example, if you were given all the dogs, a sample of all the dogs, you could put them all together into that family tree. You can't do that with organisms whose ancestors are no longer alive. That's why fossils are so important. And when you look in the fossil record, you see some very important information. The lower you go in the strata of rock, the older the fossil is. So as you work your way down, those are older and older ancestors. And what you see are intermediates, species that gave rise to later species. And so they have intermediate. Those are called transitional fossils, evidence of species with similarities to the ancestral group and similarities to the descendant species. Adaptive traits take many forms. For example, echolocation in bats is an adaptation for catching insects in the dark. And in stick insects, like the one in this picture here, the ability to physically and behaviorally mimic the plants they live on is an adaptation for avoiding detection in predators. So let's talk about that one for a minute. You can see if the insect was to evolve so that it looked like the branch, that would be an advantageous adaptation because it allows them to live long enough to mate. It might make them look weird. It might seem like a strange adaptation. It even might not make them bigger, stronger, faster, but it allows them to not be killed so that they can get to reproductive age and put their genes in the next generation. That's why some traits are weird. Because it isn't always bigger, stronger, faster. You would think it would be because of the idea of survival of the fittest, but fitness actually means the percentage of your genes that you put in the next generation. It's not going to the gym and getting fit. It's a totally different vocab word. Many shared characteristics result from organisms having a common ancestor. We talked about that earlier. And a common descent means those organisms share a common ancestor. So the group in the tree that are close together, that's common descent from a common ancestor. Here's some vocab terms that we use in evolution. One is called homologous trait, and those are similar features in a species that have common descent. They begin to look different from one another over time. So if you look here, this bone in our upper arm looks different in different ancestors because they've diverged over time. So you'll hear the term homologous trait. It would be what you would compare when you look at them. And the ones that are the closest together would be the closest related to each other. And usually in the fossil record, they're closer together. There's another term called vestigial traits. Those are features that are no longer working, and so they are left over. They can be a clue, though, as to who the ancestor was. So in this whale, for example, you have a large flipper, but you have a tiny little femur because it doesn't need it, but it's left over. That's called a vestigial trait or vestigial feature. The biggest piece of evidence is DNA. And this was not known for years. For years, all there was the fossil record. But with the advent of DNA sequencing technology and our knowledge of genes and our ability to sequence entire organisms, you can easily, with computers, compare them. So all living organisms on Earth use DNA, which is deciphered using the same genetic code, includes organisms such as bacteria, redwood trees, and humans. One of the strongest pieces of evidence that all living organisms come from a common ancestor is found by studying DNA. So, for example, here's a gene. Here are the letters of DNA, A, T, G, and C. You can line them up on the computer and compare them to other organisms. So this is a gene for insulin. So most organisms that are mammals have it, for example, and even chickens have it. And so you can see that we're not very similar to chickens with our DNA. We're not very similar to chickens physically and nor biochemically, but also DNA wise. But as you compare the humans to the mouse, there's more similarities, less differences, and ultimately to the chimpanzee, there's only one difference, which means, as it says here, 98.4% similarity in the insulin gene between humans and chimps. Now, no surprise there, right? They look similar. It's believed that they're related, right? So no surprises, but it's more of a confirmation at the molecular level. All right, another piece of evidence is biogeography. The Earth's continents are on massive tectonic plates. That goes way back to earth science class. These move slowly in a process of continental drift. 250 million years ago, all land masses had drifted together to form a giant continent, supercontinent called Pangaea. And so the biogeography of a species traces where it came from. So if you here, you can see the continents of Earth. There's fitting together like a puzzle piece to fit Pangea. And if you look at this species of lungfish, it only lives here in Australia today in modern times, but there's evidence, fossil record evidence, that it was in many other places on Earth. So that is the biogeography, which gives a clue to its ancestry. The last line of evidence for evolution is called embryonic development. If you look at developing embryos, they often have features that are resembling their ancestors. So here, for example, in dolphins, you see a green, which is a forelimb, and a purple, which is a hind limb. And even though they maintain their forelimb, which becomes flippers, the hind limb does not develop into flippers, but you can still see it in embryonic development, and that's considered an evidence for embryos. It's kind of a complicated concept to explain, but it's just good to know that embryonic development is one of the categories. So that's the last line of evidence for evolution. Those are good to know because sometimes you'll be asked that and you'll want to know. But the question really is, what do you think? Are you convinced? Many people are convinced, many people are not convinced, and it is in some ways a controversial topic. So if it doesn't jive with what your personal views are, I would encourage you to study it as an academic topic, to know it for the sake of knowing it. It's good for conversation. It's important for getting through biology class, but also be encouraged that there are many people of faith who have found a way to reconcile their faith and evolution. And they have ways of either compartmentalizing them or harmonizing them. More about that later. This is chapter 11, Evidence for Evolution.